welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. When I was in my 20s, I got introduced to a friend of a friend in a nightclub. The fellow in question seemed to be a pretty ordinary guy. He was just a few years older than I was at the time, actually. He was of average build and average looks. He and I didn't really speak very much at all, apart from saying hello. He was my friend's friend, and I barely even registered him at the time. Nightclubs can be pretty noisy, and this one was as noisy as any other. I do recall, though, that the fellow was chatting a little with our mutual friend. I was probably either just sipping a drink nearby and watching people dance or something, or maybe I was even dancing myself. I can't remember exactly how much I was interacting with this person or what was happening at the time, because at the moment, it was of very little significance to me, really. It was just another introduction to another friend of a friend in another crowded club on any average night in my 20s. But I ended up remembering this stranger, this man that I'd barely interacted with, who I barely even met, because of something that I learned about him on the drive home from the nightclub later that night. So I guess it would have been whenever my friend and I left the club, early hours of the morning, I guess, and he was driving me home. He was actually driving a few people home. There were others with us. And right now, I can't remember whether they had come with us to the club or whether they were just bumming a ride from us later in the evening. But either way, they were also in the discussion about this fellow in the club, because the conversation took place in the car and they were in the car. So I remember they were there. And I guess that's the only thing that's important. It was, after all, more than 30 years ago that I heard this story. Just goes to show what we remember about significant moments in our lives and the things that we tend to forget as well. Anywho, I can't remember how his name came up exactly, but I do recall someone saying that he was really wealthy. Now, I don't know what they meant exactly by wealthy at the time. After all, we were in our 20s, and being able to fill up your car with petrol made you seem pretty flush back then. We were all working the average kind of job of a 20-something-year-old. We spent most of our money on going out to clubs or maybe paying rent or something if we weren't still living at home with mum and dad. So it was our early 20s. And I guess we would have been a mix of people who rented an apartment with a couple of friends, probably 6 of us to an apartment, to be honest, and others were probably still living at home with parents. But the way it sounded, this fellow that everyone was talking about was really wealthy, the kind of wealthy that none of us would probably ever be in our lifetimes. So the story of this fellow went a little bit like this. He was just an ordinary guy. I think he was a car mechanic, actually. I remember he had bought an old vintage car. That's what they were talking about. And my friends were saying about how he had restored the car and hotted it up a little bit. This was the 1980s, and most guys did that with their first cars that I knew anyway. They bought an old bomb and they fixed up the engine themselves in their garage. If they had a friend who worked in the right industry, they might also get a cheap spray paint job done. Most of the young guys back then were living in poverty as they saved up to buy fat wheels for their cars and fat exhaust pipes that would cause their cars to roar down the road really loudly. It was a very 1980s kind of thing to do. And pretty much every guy I knew at the time was striving to turn some rundown old jalopy into a fierce roadster. Anyway, the way my friends described it, this fellow was doing the same thing with his own car. And he seemed to have mechanical know-how, the old-fashioned kind, back from before all the cars became electrical, and they had all these fancy components where you needed a gadget to be able to diagnose anything. He was living with his girlfriend that he'd had for a few years. They had been together, I think it was probably 3 to 4 years, something like that. And apparently she'd been a bit of a bully towards this fellow the whole time they'd been dating. He never seemed to be good enough for her in some way. She frequently criticized him and told him he was lazy or a no-hoper or something along those lines. Honestly, I don't know why people stay in relationships with people who constantly put them down, but apparently they do. And this fellow was also being constantly berated by his girlfriend, just like other victims in relationships are. But apparently he did love her because he never actually left her. As it turns out, though, she left him at one point. I think I recall my friend saying that she was badgering the guy to get married, and something was holding him back. She kept saying, why haven't you proposed to me yet? Why aren't you putting me first? And you're never going to propose to me. You're not making me a priority. You're such a loser that you expect me to hang around here forever without you proposing, and that kind of thing. And in a way, if that's how she felt, I guess she was justified in voicing her opinion. After all, if she wanted to get married to the guy that she was already living with, then she had a right to say how she felt. Maybe a little bit nicer than what I'd heard, but she still had that right. But he also had the right to do whatever he felt comfortable doing. And for some reason, he hadn't proposed to her yet. And apparently, it had been decided that he was the one who had to propose in order to move their relationship forward. He never left his girlfriend, but for some reason, he also couldn't quite bring himself to commit to marrying her either. I mean, who knows? Maybe he was waiting until he knew he could provide for a family. Maybe he just wanted to get a bit older. Maybe he didn't feel as though marriage was necessary. Or maybe he just wasn't sure that this was the woman he wanted to come home to forever and to commit to forever. I guess he's the only one who knew how he felt. All I know is that she wanted to get married and he never proposed. And so she ran out of patience and she left him. She moved out of the house, and from what I understand, the breakup between them was quite nasty. She didn't contribute to niceness. Not so much from the guy, at least not according to what my friends said. They were all describing him as being a really nice, happy-go-lucky fellow who just wanted to live a simple life, enjoy his days and his nights, socializing and playing sports and just feeling low-key and low stress. And his girlfriend was a bit bossy, very high stress, with a very high stress personality, who ended up being really nasty towards him when their relationship ended, and quite hurtful too. There's more details to come. So the story continued. During the time that they were together, the fellow had played the lottery. He always played in a syndicate every Saturday night. Back then in the 80s, the lotto, which is what we call it here in Australia, only took place once a week on Saturday night. You'd buy a ticket, either your own numbers or you'd get a random quick pick of numbers that were chosen by the machine. And then on Saturday night, you'd sit and you'd watch the lotto results with anticipation on TV. Things have gotten more complicated these days, but back then, I think that's pretty much the way it worked. That there were 45 numbers to choose from, and each player could choose or randomly get assigned 6 of those numbers. And then the show on Saturday nights would involve an air machine blowing all 45 numbered balls around until 8 numbers or balls with numbers on them were chosen. 6 of them were primary numbers, and then there were 2 supplementary numbers. There were 6 possible levels of win that a player or a syndicate of players could get. And the payout for those levels of win ranged from something like $5 to $10, all the way up to $2 to $3 million, depending on how many other winners there were in that level of win. And in order to win the jackpot, a player or a syndicate would need to correctly choose 6 primary numbers. All 6 primary numbers chosen for the game would need to exactly match the primary numbers chosen to get the number 1 jackpot. Well, our fellow contributed to the syndicate of people that he worked with, which I guess must have been a mechanic shop or wherever it was that he worked. If that happens to be what he did for a living. Back in the 80s, there were probably between 6 and 10 people maybe working in the average mechanic's shop, like garage. It was probably, it wasn't electronic like now, and so there was real labor involved, and there'd be the boss and a receptionist and people like that. Back in the good old days when people actually worked in places together, other than, instead of, working from home remotely. And it's not quite as isolating as it is now. You know, the average mechanic shop probably only has 2 or 3 people working there and no receptionists, and maybe they outsourced to a bookkeeper somewhere. But back then, there would have been a whole group of people. Anyway, they were playing the weekly syndicate game with the workmates, and he was living with his girlfriend, and everything was normal, just like it had always been. He was getting bullied about being a bit of a loser by his girlfriend, and she was running the relationship in some way, and she was running the house. And who knows, maybe she was justified, maybe she was irritated in the relationship, but it doesn't matter. But you know what happened? One week, that syndicate, that lotto syndicate, it actually won a few $1,000s on the lottery. I'm not sure exactly how much it was, but my friends didn't seem to know the actual figure. But I do know that the way that they described it, it wasn't really enough money to be life-changing or anything like that. But it was, you know, kind of a nice little win, a few $1,000s for the whole group at work. And our fellow, well, he did the most infuriating thing according to his girlfriend. He gave his share of the winnings to his mother as a gift. His mum was a widow. She lived alone. And I'm not sure whether our guy had any siblings or anything like that. So I'm not sure why he decided to give the money to his mum specifically. Maybe it was just that his mother was getting older and he thought it might help her out. And because he was still really young, he figured he could still earn whatever that money that he'd won was in his lifetime. It wasn't life-changing. It was only maybe $1,000 was his share. It could have been any reason that he decided to share it with his mum. And he could have done whatever he wanted with it. It was his. And so he gave it to his mother. And that drove his girlfriend bananas. She was absolutely livid. She got very angry and said that she'd been with him for years and he refused to marry her. And now he was giving his money away when she considered it to be their joint money. Because after all, they shared a life together and he could have used that money to enhance both of their lives. But instead, he gave their money to someone else. And now she knew that he was never going to marry her. And she knew that he was just a loser who would never amount to anything. And she knew that she was wasting her time. And so she left. But that's not all she did. When she left our fellow, she also set out to really hurt his feelings. She told him that she was leaving him for another guy, someone who wasn't a loser. So a direct comparison. Now, I don't know whether she was actually seeing another guy, but either way, she could have just left him, you know. To be so cruel as to throw the concept of a better man in his face and to do comparisons by claiming that one is a good catch and the other one is a loser is really mean and unnecessary. But that's apparently what she decided to do. And it seems that she really broke his heart. He was devastated. Because even though she doesn't sound like a particularly easy person to love, according to my friends, our fellow actually really did love her. And then a month later, our fellow, who was still playing the lottery, well, this time he bought a ticket all by himself, not in the syndicate this time. Maybe the syndicate had disbanded because they had won and figured that, you know, that was the end of their luck. But he continued to wager. And so he bought a ticket all by himself and he won the jackpot. He won something in the region of $2 to $3 million. Now, we're talking about the 1980s. And over here in Australia, $2 to $3 million is definitely not worth what it was worth back then. So I went online and I asked the Bing AI bot to convert the $2 to $3 million amount into what it would be worth or equivalent to today. And the bot responded that the value of that win today in Australia would be somewhere between $6 and $10 million today. So that's a lovely and indeed a very life-changing win. With between $6 to $10 million in Australia, you can do pretty much whatever you like. And if you invest it well and purchased property back in the 80s, well, you would probably have over $100 million by now because property has skyrocketed. And it was just 1 month after our fellow had been dumped quite unceremoniously by his girlfriend. Now, I'm going to tell you now, this actually is a true story. I never met this fellow again. I never heard anything about him again from my friends, but I never forgot about him because of that story. And I wanted to say that I remembered his name. I think it might have been Tim, but I'm not sure. Tim as in Timothy, I think. I'd love to know what happened to Tim, because what my friends told me back then is that he did invest his money quite sensibly. By the time I heard this story, it had already been a few years since he'd won the lottery. And he didn't go crazy and he didn't blow it, all over town. Instead, he did something sensible, which resulted in him creating even more wealth for himself. And the other thing I know is that the girlfriend that had left him also tried to sue him for half of his winnings, but her lawsuit against him didn't get very far because by the time he'd won the lottery, she was his ex-girlfriend and had already moved out of their shared home. So she had no claim to anything he managed to achieve or earn after she had dumped him. And I remember everyone in the car that night laughing ironically as they discussed this aspect of the story. They called it karma, and I guess it was karma. After all, our fellow, maybe Tim, if that was his name, had already won a little money, but had given it away to someone who for some reason he felt needed it more than him, his mum. And his karma was to win even more than before. A massive amount by anyone's standards back in the 80s. And his girlfriend, well, she got her karma as well. She acted dreadfully towards a man who might not have been all the things that she wanted in her life, that she wanted to be, but a person is entitled to be whatever they naturally are, and to treat them like they're worthless just because they aren't what you want, and then to go out of your way to hurt them, well, that's just cruel. And so I guess the girlfriend's karma was equally cruel, wasn't it? Kind of delicious. And so the reason why I remember this story so well is because it was a story about karma. The karma was very clearly dished out. And over the years, I've noticed that the universe does like to dish out karma. In fact, I have a saying that listeners on the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel are probably very familiar with by now, and that is that the universe always wins. Sometimes it takes a while, but whatever you're due, you will eventually get from the universe because that's karma. So why don't we take a look at the issue of karma today? Let's find out more about where the concept of karma comes from, how it manifests in our lives, and maybe even if there's a connection between our current lives, the energies of the universe, and the afterlife. So first things first. I love to go as deep as I can. And that way I can really find out where something originates from. I'm afraid I like to go deep. Well, the word karma is an example of that. The word karma is a Sanskrit word that means action or deed. It's a fundamental concept in several Indian religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. The principles of karma is based on the law of cause and effect, where every action has consequences that affect a person's future. So to explain it a bit more, the cause and effect element relates to a person's actions. Regardless of whether their actions are good or bad in nature, those actions will always lead to consequences. Good actions lead to positive outcomes, and bad actions lead to negative outcomes. But it's not just cut and dry like that. There's actually more to it, according to the ancient Indian religions. A person's intentions are key to the principles of karma. If you have good intentions, but your actions inadvertently lead to something bad happening, you won't be punished with bad karma. And if you accidentally do something good while you're intending to do harm, you won't be rewarded by positive karma. Of course, life doesn't happen in a vacuum that way, so hundreds of actions are all taking place at once, thousands even, maybe even millions all at once, because while the days and nights are rolling by, people all over the world are acting out in good and bad ways, and our interdependencies may mean that karma is swift for some and takes a bit longer for others. I think it feels sometimes as though the biggest bad people seem to have to wait a lot longer for their negative consequences to finally arrive. For example, if a person is really corrupt and never seems to suffer any consequences at all, it just seems unfair. Does that mean that karma hasn't happened and it will never occur? Personally, I think karma does occur. It may just happen in ways that are a little bit creative. So, for example, if we're talking about a man who's particularly corrupt, his karma might be that he never finds a wife who genuinely loves him. So he's never truly able to trust anyone or experience real love or a real sense of safety around other people. Or his children might hate his guts or plot against him or betray him in some way. Or he might end up suffering ill health his entire life, despite enjoying the comfort of ill-gotten gains. Or in some other way he might suffer. And as outsiders, we might not be able to see his suffering, but he's still suffering a negative karma that is a form of punishment for his corrupt ways. I think that really is a possibility. And sometimes a person can be rewarded for their good or bad intentions very quickly as well. I know that I have experienced too many karmic outcomes in my life to ignore that karma does indeed exist. And one of the most notable recently was when I went out of my way to help a woman and her children that I happened to stumble across one morning. They were fleeing from an abusive home. And even though I didn't know them, I felt compelled to help. It was a strange physical compulsion. So I gave them money. I really couldn't afford to give them that money at the time. The money I gave them was like an impulse that I couldn't stop from happening. And later on, after it was all done and I was alone again, I discovered that while I was giving my money to strangers, I was getting more than twice as much of that money in spontaneous donations from new supporters on Patreon. I actually did a video about this moment and published it onto YouTube the very day after it happened, because to me, it felt like a moment of karma coming from the universe, as though I was being told that I'd done the right thing. And so something very similar, perhaps even more so, was also coming my way. I actually, as I said, I did record the incident the day after it happened, and I do have that video, which I'll provide a link for in the description for today's episode, if you'd like to see it for yourself. So the ancient religions of India also link karma to the concept of a person's rebirth after death. In Buddhism and Hinduism and others, it's said that every person spends their life accumulating the positive and negative karma of their actions, which then influences the outcomes of their next life. For example, if you're a man who's cruel towards animals in your life, you could, in your next life, become born as an animal who is treated cruelly. And whatever it is that you are now could very well be a result of what you were before. Karma is about reminding us to be personally, morally responsible for how we live our lives. Because according to the concept of karma, we are the architects who design our future, which is defined by how we have acted before. As it happens, karma is not just a single consequence that is either negative or positive by nature. There are actually 4 different types of karma, and each is subtly different. So the first is described as Sanchita karma, which represents the sum of all past actions that a person has taken in many lifetimes. Ancient Indian philosophy describes it to be like a cosmic bank account, where every action you take is being invested into your account. It sits there accumulating interest and basically becomes a long-term investment that you make in yourself. So if you invest wisely in yourself over the periods of your lives, your multiple lives, not just this life, but all of your lives, your wealth and value as a person becomes very much like the average of your entire investment. This type of karma sounds a little difficult to keep up with. I mean, how do you know what your investment has been in a previous life? Does this mean you have to try and compensate in positive ways for bad things you might have done before that you might not even be aware of? Can you sneak in a couple of bad behaviors and will it not make much difference? I don't know. It kind of sounds like this might be a sort of a strange mix of the both. And in that instance, I'd probably want to err on the side of developing more good karma. I don't know, just to sort of beat the odds. The second kind of karma is prarabdha karma, which is when a portion of the first type of karma, the sanchita karma, is already playing out in your current life. This is like destiny taking you down a path that you deserve based on the investments in your karma bank account that you made in previous lives. In ancient philosophy, it's described to be like the script of your life as it would appear in a play. It has already been written, and now it's being enacted with you as the center lead character. In this instance, you have to spend your life paying attention to the things that you're experiencing in ways that feel like rewards or punishment for actions in your past lives. And you have to live them out while also you simultaneously do your best to maximize positive karma and minimize negative karma with the things that you do in your life. This sounds a little bit tough. What if you're experiencing a really difficult life and your first instinct is to be an angry, awful person about it? But to make your next life better, you have to teach yourself, sort of train yourself to be far better than you naturally want to be given your circumstances. And so the third kind of karma is kriyamana karma. And that's the immediate karma that a person creates with their current actions. Kriyamana karma is within our control right now, and it directly shapes our present outcomes. So, for example, if you commit a crime and get caught, you are experiencing the karma of the crime that you've committed. If we go back to the analogy of being an actor in a play of your own life, then yes, you are the actor, but also the writer of the play who designs the action, plays the part, and also determines the way that the play ends. So that's 3 so far. And the fourth kind of karma is agami karma. This is the future karma that arises in your next life, but which is determined by a person's actions in their current life. Ancient Indian philosophy describes agami karma to be like planting a seed that will blossom into whatever it turns out to be in the future. A person's present actions are, once again, like an investment that will either yield good or bad results at the point of maturity further down the line in the next life. Now, the concept of karma is rooted in the ancient Indian religions that I mentioned earlier. But each of these religions see karma as in a slightly different way, or the emphasis is different, or has different aspects in ways that karma is set as a principle. So, for example, in Hinduism, the 4 different types of karma are all working together at once. We're currently, with everything that we do, experiencing karma from our past investments, creating new investments that we'll experience later, and are playing out the investments, whether short or long term, that are presented because of who we are right now and what we're doing right now in our current existence. But in Buddhism, karma is viewed a little bit differently. It isn't based on reward and punishment like it is in Hinduism. Instead, in Buddhism, karma is seen to be a natural law of moral causation. It's a natural consequence of a person's actions. So Buddhists explain that the inequalities and differences that can be seen throughout the world are caused by karma, which is linked to the balance and interdependencies of all living things. For example, if someone is suffering, then we are responsible for not suffering, because everything evens out in a way. Jainism views karma to be like a subtle ethereal substance that attaches itself to a person's soul and causes a shift in the soul's purity. And so in this case, a person needs to find ways to eliminate negative karma by purifying their soul. The ways in which a person purifies their soul is through their conduct, the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom, and by staying true in their faith. And then in Sikhism, there's a belief that karma does indeed exist as it is described in the other Indian religions. However, it's also believed that God can override karma with his grace. And so an emphasis on living a righteous life in order to gain God's grace is key to good karma. I never really have been a fan of the self-serving faith business. It sounds a little bit untrustworthy to me, like you're only being a nice person because you expect something in return. I mean, if that's the case, are you really a nice person at all? It kind of, I don't know, maybe I misunderstood this last bit with the Sikhism, but it really did sound like being righteous was only an attractive option for people who want to gain something from it. And I thought the whole idea was to be righteous because you want to be righteous and you believe in being righteous as a way of life. You see, this is the whole thing about not being a very religious person. I sometimes just don't get some of the subtleties. I don't see the point. I have to be honest. Okay, so let's take a look at karma from the perspective of other religions and faiths. Because the earliest known concepts of karma may come from ancient Indian philosophy, but karma isn't exclusive to Indian philosophy. It's also discussed in other faiths from around the world. So in Christianity, for example, karma works within the concept of sins and righteousness. Everything in life hinges on the last judgment in which righteous Christians will be saved and delivered to spend eternity with God. And what each reap, we all reap what we sow, which is written in Galatians 6:7, also in Matthew 26:52, which states that those who live by the sword die by the sword, indicating that people who, they will get what they deserve during their lives once they've been judged by God in the afterlife. But Christianity differs significantly from the ancient Indian concept of karma, because according to Indian philosophy, karma is a continuous and ongoing process that occurs across all of our multiple lives. But in Christianity, a person is subject to a single, one-time only review of their life at the end of their life. And then what they experience as a result of that review, they will experience the consequence of that for the remainder of eternity. So, no pressure or anything like that. I mean, honestly, I kind of like the sound of the Indian concept of karma much better. At least that way, I have many chances to improve my position over time. The Christian understanding of life consequence sounds very final, and given that Christianity also seems to push the idea that we're all just naturally sinners, it sort of seems like an impossible situation where we can't improve our situation and are destined to suffer for eternity. And I mean, there are over 150 sins, I think, something like that. I think there's 160 sins in the Bible. So how is a person meant to keep up with all of those and maintain a job and a family and keep a roof over their head? And maybe that's one of the reasons why Christianity is experiencing so much flux in the modern day. It's just filled with so many rules that sometimes people just can't keep up with. And whatever they do now is final for the future. So Judaism is another one of the Abrahamic religions that deal with the concept of karma. And it's actually referred to as the measure for measure. In Judaism, karma, although it's not called that, is a kind of retribution from the divine that's dished out by God in direct response to a person's actions. Divine retribution can occur against a person or a group or all of humanity. And one of the examples that I've mentioned quite a few times on this show is the Great Flood, which is described in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. God considered mankind to be unredeemable, and so he created a great flood to destroy all life on earth, and he only spared a few righteous people, along with a few of each animal species, and he left them to repopulate a new world and start again from scratch. Another very extreme measure of karma, according to God's will. Honestly, no wonder so many people feel bruised and sore after a lifetime of religious faith in some of these Abrahamic religions. There really is no wriggle room for a person at all. It's very difficult to be good and righteous, and it's far too easy to be seen as bad or an ungodly sinner. Over the past 3 weeks, we've been discussing the world of Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, which is really still the foundation from which spiritualism and spiritualists such as myself and many people listening today, that's where they gain, or we gain, our understanding of the concept of karma. The philosophy of theosophy is one of the most popular understandings of karma in the Western world and is centered on the concept of what goes around comes around. It is actually based on a concept called the law of return, which is also sometimes called the threefold law. Now, under the law of return, or the threefold law, the belief is that whatever energy a person gives out to the universe, they will receive back times 3. And this relates to positive and negative outcomes. So in very simplistic terms, if you donate $1 to help another person, or if you give 1 hour of your support or your time to support someone in need, somewhere in your life, you will receive $3 back, or the universe will ensure that people share 3 hours of their time to help you when you need assistance. I actually do believe that this concept is generally true. I'm not saying that the other concepts aren't true, but with some of those concepts, there really isn't any proof of whether something you did in the past life, for example, is coming back to haunt you in your current life. But the threefold law is something that I've experienced many times in my life. For example, I've already mentioned mentioned briefly about that woman and her children that I helped with money. While I was giving them my money, which I could feel I really couldn't afford, but I felt compelled to do it, I was receiving, without my knowledge, more than twice as much in the background at exactly the same moment in time, which I didn't know about until later in the day when I just happened to find out. And strangely, every time I clean out my closets and donate a ton of stuff to charity, for example, I seem to get a really cheap quote from a very good tradesman or something for something I need done in the house. And the job is done honestly with beautiful workmanship and things like that. And whenever I'm kind to people, I seem to get so much kindness in return, often from people who have no idea about whatever kindness I had shown to someone else. There does seem to be something there when it comes to this threefold law. And on the occasions that I've done something, a bit naughty, for example, to cut corners or to get my way, or because I was angry or lazy or whatever, somewhere, somehow down the line, I end up having to do twice as much to make up for whatever it is I should have done right in the first place. I've noticed that as well, and it happens a lot. I started paying attention, which is why I could see it happening in my life. And that's why I believe it to be true. If you haven't done this already, try it in your own life. I mean, really, I do, I swear. It won't be the first or the second time, but if you consistently keep your eyes open or even jot things down and do good things just because you can, you will begin to see good things coming your way as well. And often the good that you receive is much more valuable to you than whatever it is that you had to sacrifice along the way. But mindset has a lot to do with it as well. So there needs to be no expectation as to what you're going to get in return in order for you to get the return. Just try it. So anyway, we've looked at the concept of karma from the religious or faith and spirituality-based perspective. And we've looked at how the concept of karma originated through the ancient Indian philosophers. But what about the scientific explanations for karma? What about psychology and the explanations of how humanity might experience karma from a psychoanalytical perspective? As it happens, science and psychology do agree with the more esoteric concepts of karma relating to cause and effect. But the explanations are far more sterile, of course. In science, positive actions lead to positive outcomes and negative actions lead to negative outcomes, but only where certain observable criteria are present. So that sounds really scientific. So if you commit a crime and someone sees you do it, or your DNA is left at the scene, or you're captured on CCTV committing the crime, then you will probably suffer negative consequences. But if the crime can't be proven, then you probably won't. That's the scientific explanation. In behavioral psychology, karma is really considered to be an issue of behavioral conditioning. So it is kind of reversed in a way. If you're rewarded for exhibiting positive actions, then you're more likely to exhibit positive actions. A bit like giving your dog a treat every time they sit on command. And also staying with the theme of dogs, for example, negative reinforcement leads to negative behaviors. Like, have you ever been to the park and you see a dog owner screaming at their dog to get here right now? And the dog is ignoring them, because why would the dog want to return to their owner if the owner is yelling at them? The quickest way to get a dog to come back to you is to give them love and affection when they do, even if you've just caught them chewing your neighbor's carefully cultivated flower patch in the front garden or something like that, because the dog will associate your affection and positive reward with the most recent thing they did to deserve it, which is when they return to you. If you punish them for coming back to you when you call them, then why would they want to come back to you when you call them? It's sort of, they'll stop doing it. It's not really rocket science. And that's the psychoanalytical perspective of karma. Science also considers karma in the context of social psychology, which is when people are motivated to act in positive ways that will benefit other people because they expect something positive in return. According to science, this leads to a more cooperative and harmonious society. But I'm not sure that it does, actually. It's like what I said earlier. If you're only being nice because you want something in return, are you really being nice? Or are you someone who essentially can't be trusted to stay nice if for a moment you stop believing that you're going to get something in return for your niceness? Or perhaps if someone stops watching you being nice. So, I don't know. Science also has a theory that when people believe in karma, they are encouraged to act more ethically than they would if they didn't believe in karma. And that a belief in karma encourages a sense of moral development and a desire to climb to higher stages of development that will allow the world to raise its ethical standards and principles overall. I mean, I actually really like this aspect of the scientific explanation about karma. Yes, believing in karma does make a person want to raise their moral or ethical baseline. And I also agree that it helps to give all of humanity a desire to raise its overall standards. Maybe this is what's actually lacking in the religions that single out a person's life as being just one chance to live on earth. For example, Christianity includes the concept that we live once and either die righteous or not righteous. And then we live forever, or we don't live with God forever. So there's nothing to strive for during our life. And if you feel as though you've fallen short, wouldn't that mean that you kind of give up in a way? Because there's nothing to look forward to after death, particularly if deep down inside you know you haven't been a good enough example of righteousness. I don't know. Or maybe you could just be horrible your entire life and be righteous in the last 5 years and then end up going to God. Do I sound a bit pedantic? I don't know. It just doesn't feel like that's the way it's supposed to be. It feels wrong and very, very artificial. And finally, science, and in particular psychology, believes that the concepts of karma provides a psychological comfort to people, which helps to explain things like suffering and injustice. It kind of suggests that maybe these unpleasant or painful experiences are part of something much bigger than what appears on the surface, or what it appears to be on the surface, a bigger, more meaningful pattern of universal law. Science says that this is something that can help people to cope with adverse conditions, and it offers them a way to maintain faith in there being a brighter future ahead when times are tough now. And then, of course, we can't talk about karma without talking about free will, Because if karma is the way in which the universe provides us with lessons in which we can learn to be a better person by believing that our actions directly influence our experiences, either in the moment or later in life or even in the next life, well, if our actions lead to our karma, then our free will is also linked, because it's our free will that will determine which actions we take. Free will is the power to make choices that are not determined by past actions or external forces. I've actually done an entire episode on free will not that long ago, so I'll provide a link to that episode in the description info for today's show as well, just in case you'd like to hear it. I happen to believe that free will is a real thing and that not everything we do is based on a predetermined set of circumstances. There are, of course, people who don't believe in free will, and whether it's science or just personal opinion, I guess everyone is entitled to their own viewpoint. There have been moments in my life in which I've wondered why I did something, why I acted in the way that I did, or didn't act when in a way that I normally would. And I've wondered if perhaps my free will didn't exist in that moment because of how peculiar the moment was. But generally, I believe that life is a combination of destiny, predetermined circumstances that kind of influence the parameters of our free will, and then, of course, our absolute autonomy to decide our own path, once destiny and determination have been taken into account. At first, karma and free will may seem like two contradictory kind of forces. If our actions have consequences which have been determined by our past deeds, then how can we truly have the free will to make choices? Our past has set us up so that we can only naturally or instinctively follow whatever path we've been engineered to follow, right? I don't know. I used to have a show on YouTube that invited guests to come on and chat about their past supernatural experiences or their expertise in spiritual practice like numerology, astrology, or faith healing, things like that. Anyway, I remember I was chatting with one guest and I mentioned that I really value my personal freedom. It's something that is very important to me. And of course, what this meant to me at the time was that if I'm given a choice, I would choose whatever it is that would allow me to continue to live freely rather than be shackled by somebody else's expectations or restrictions or opinions. But then my guest, she said to me that the reason why I valued my freedom so much is because I was a slave in my previous life, and I hadn't been able to live freely in that life. And so obviously I had brought my strong desire for freedom with me into the next life, into my present life. I can't remember now whether she said that she got that information from somewhere like the Akashic Records, or maybe that she was psychic, or some other thing. I don't remember where she said she got it from, but it did make me wonder, is it possible that I only really value freedom this much as one of the highest priorities on my life list because I wasn't free in the past? And if that's the case, do I really have the free will to choose freedom, or am I just conditioned to choose it? And is that an example of karma, or is it something else? If it's karma, for example, it means that I must have been a very good slave who was given karmic recognition, which allowed me to be reincarnated into a free person in the next life. But because I have remnants of my previous life inside me, determining how I respond to things, then my free will to choose freedom is really predetermined by my karma. Oh dear, this is starting to sound a little bit like a cycle, isn't it? Interestingly, many spiritual traditions, including the Indian traditions mentioned at the top of today's episode, include the belief that karma and free will coexist in harmony and actually complement each other quite well, a little bit like a cycle that's continuously in motion. Karma sets the stage in the relationship. It influences the circumstances in which a person experiences their life. It shapes the conditions and opportunities that the person encounters. And that is because the actions that a person took in the past has led to certain situations or challenges occurring for them in the present. And then the actions or choice that they made now in the present will subsequently lead to situations or challenges that they face in the future. But it's all kind of happening at once, as though the past, the present, and the future are all intertwined into this almost like a string of DNA where everything is all joining together. So if karma sets the stage, then free will determines the response. We're like an actor in a play, and the play is in progress. The stage has been set. And as we're born, it's like we're stepping onto the stage for the first time. But the stage has been there long before we ever arrived, and the play is already in motion. Our job is to continue to play our part in the play. But we get to improvise. So we may not have any control over the play and how other actors in the play will respond, and we don't have any control over how the stage is designed or how our performance is perceived by the audience or what is planned by others who are also acting in the play in ways that they feel is right for them. Well, we may not be able to control any of that, but we do have control over our reactions, our decisions, and our actions in the play. And because we're participating in the play, just like everyone else, we will influence the outcomes somewhere on a scale of possibilities, ranging from very little influence all the way up to 100% full influence. But because everyone else is doing the same thing, the interdependencies of karma and free will with all of these people is really like a massive and very complex web of interconnected factors. In Buddhism, those interconnected factors are acknowledged, and they're called dependent origination. Buddhism suggests that all phenomena arises in dependence of multiple causes and conditions. What this means is that our actions are influenced by many other interconnected factors, some directly related to us, others indirectly related, and others still that are barely connected at all, but somehow become connected to us over time and space. The complex web of interconnectedness allows us to make conscious choices which will travel around the web and lead to karmic outcomes, sometimes for us, sometimes for others, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes in positive ways, and sometimes in negative ways. But the interconnected web is organic and continually absorbing the decisions and actions of everyone in it. In the 1960s, a meteorologist by the name of Edward Lorenz coined the phrase butterfly effect. Edward described it as being when the smallest change in weather systems eventually leads to enormous consequences. 60 years later, and the term has been used to describe lots of interdependencies of life, including the relationship between karma and free will. So the first time I'd ever heard of the term butterfly effect was when I read a short story by a fellow called Ray Bradbury. The story was called A Sound of Thunder. It's a great way to show the interdependence of karma and free will. I think a lot of students actually read this in school too. The story takes place in the future around 2050 or 2060 or something like that. Time travel is possible, and wealthy adventurers are invited to travel back in time so that they can hunt for wild animals that are extinct in the present moment. A rich fellow called Eccles pays $10,000 to join a safari to hunt dinosaurs. I think he wanted to hunt a Tyrannosaurus or something, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, I think. He's transported back 1,000,000 years and he joins the safari. Just before Eccles and his safari group leave for the safari, they strike up a conversation about politics. They're all really happy with their preferred politician who was recently elected to be president. They are then transported in time to the safari, but are given a strict warning not to touch anything and to stay on what sounds like a bit of a conveyor belt kind of pathway that they're going to be traveling on during the safari. Their travel guide is really strict, and he tells them that it's imperative that they never touch anything that they see because even the smallest interference with the past could have a massive snowball effect and result in a catastrophic change in history. The safari is focused on prey that don't really have much of an impact on the future. And so this is all carefully explained and a big part of the trip. So all of these adventurers, they arrive in the past around 60 million years ago, and they begin their safari. Eccles sees a Tyrannosaurus rex, but instead of shooting at it, he gets a bit overwhelmed by the dinosaur's size and he panics. In fact, I think he runs away and he hides in a nearby forest, so he leaves the conveyor belt. But while he did that, he accidentally stepped on and killed a butterfly. Somehow he recovers his nerve, and his fellow travelers end up killing the dinosaur. So when the threat is gone, Eccles returns to the conveyor belt pathway. The group then returns to the present day, except when they arrive back, everything is different. Signs are written in a different kind of language, and then eventually it turns out that the fellow that they loved, who'd won the presidential election before they left, had actually now lost the election. And the new president was a horrible, cruel dictator. The travelers who had been rich before they left for the safari also discovered that their fortunes were different upon their return. They were all poor. All because Eccles had squashed a butterfly during their trip to the past, and the snowball effect had led to mammoth changes in the world. The story ends with a curious gunshot that appears to come from the travel guide. And I think it's supposed to imply that the travel guide shot Eccles and killed him because of what he'd done. So, is this story about karma? Was Eccles killed because he disobeyed an important natural law of time travel? Or is the story about free will and the decision that Eccles had to deviate from the conveyor belt, even though he wasn't supposed to? Or is the story about both karma and free will? Because yes, Eccles made a choice to save himself from the dinosaur because he believed in the moment that he was in danger. And his decision was one of free will. But karma says that his reckless action should have a karmic response. So he ended up dead anyway. Geez, if only Eccles had believed in karma, then maybe he would have stayed on the conveyor belt. He'd still be rich and he'd still be alive. So yes, the belief in karma encourages ethical behavior because individuals are motivated to act in ways that are beneficial to others, often because they also expect positive outcomes in return. Free will, on the other hand, empowers a person to make ethical decisions on the basis of their values and beliefs. It might also link to expectations, but it doesn't have to. And together, free will and karma form the basis for a spiritual sense of personal responsibility and mindfulness. And so let me end today's episode with my very favorite story about karma. I had a friend in England whose dog was great mates with my dog. So we often walked our dogs together. My friend was really good company. She was fun, but her disregard for the neighborhood and for other people really irritated me. She never picked up her dog's poo. That was just one example. And I would always offer her poo bags, which I always carried, but she just didn't care. One day I bumped into her as I was walking my dog. She was actually popping over to the shops to buy something, and she had her dog with her. We stopped and we chatted for a few minutes. I remember she was breaking in a new pair of suede walking shoes, a bit like Doc Marten looking things. They were pink, and I remember thinking they were a bit impractical because they were suede. Anyway, during our chat, her dog did a poo. I offered her a poo bag, but she said, nah, don't worry about it. And then we parted ways. I continued my walk, and she also went to the shops. The next time I saw her, she told me that on the way home from the shops, she had accidentally stepped in her own dog's poo. Her pretty pink suede walking boots were covered in poo. And as we know, suede is impossible to clean. Well, when it's covered in dog poo, it's definitely very difficult to clean. Now that is what I call karma. My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. But not just YouTube, also Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Threads, and of course here on KGRA. Don't forget that you can get 30% off your KGRA membership by entering promo code Ellie if you fancy a chat with like-minded watchers, experiencers, and spiritualists, and of course weirdos like me. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.